My name is Reena Mathews. I am 32 years old, and on Christmas Eve, my father stood at the head of a dinner table surrounded by every person in our family and said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "Reena, honestly, when are you going to stop pretending you're something you're not?" He did not whisper it, he did not soften it with a laugh. He said it the way someone states a fact they have been waiting a long time to deliver. My mother rearranged the centerpiece, my brother Marcus raised his glass and looked at the ceiling, and 22 people at that table waited to see if I would finally crack. I did not crack. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because not one person in that room knew what was sitting in my bank account. Not one person knew I had just closed a deal 3 days earlier that would make me the majority owner of a commercial real estate portfolio worth $41 million. Not one person knew that the company they thought I was pretending to run had been named one of the 50 fastest growing businesses in the state 2 months before. I folded my napkin, I stood up, I said, "Merry Christmas, everyone," and I walked out into the December cold. 4 weeks later, they came to me, not with apologies, with their hands out, and that is when everything that had been quiet for years became very loud indeed. And I grew up understanding very early that I was the wrong kind of daughter. Not the wrong kind in a dramatic way, not abused, not neglected in the ways that leave visible marks. My family was comfortable, church-going, respectable. We lived in a large house in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, where everyone knew the Mathews family and spoke well of them. The problem was never what happened inside that house. The problem was the gap between what that house looked like and what it felt like to grow up inside it. My father, Gerald Mathews, was an architect, successful, admired, the kind of man who commanded rooms simply by entering them. He had opinions about everything and stated them with the authority of someone who had never seriously considered being wrong. He loved me, I believe, in the way people love things they do not fully understand, from a distance, with mild frustration. My mother, Patricia, was the social architect of our family. She managed relationships, appearances, and the careful curation of what the Mathews name meant in public. She was warm to everyone, and warm to me specifically in moments when other people were watching. In private, she was not unkind, she was simply absent in the way that matters most. My brother Marcus was the inheritor of everything my father valued. He was 3 years older, athletic, charismatic, studying to be a civil engineer, following the blueprint my father had drawn for the ideal Mathews child. They spoke the same language, they laughed at the same things. When Marcus entered a room, my father's face changed in a way it never changed for me. And then there was me. I was the one who spent her teenage years filling notebooks with business ideas and market observations, and questions nobody around me thought were worth asking. I was the one who read financial news at 15, who started a reselling business at 17 from my bedroom and made $11,000 before I graduated high school, which my father called a cute experiment and my mother called a distraction from my actual studies. I was the one who turned down a guaranteed position at my father's firm to start my own company at 24. That decision was the first thing I did that my family never fully forgave me for. Gerald Mathews did not express his disappointment loudly. He expressed it in the sustained, deliberate way of a man who has decided to wait for you to fail so he can refer back to this moment. Every family gathering for 8 years had carried the faint undertone of that waiting. The company I built was a property management and investment consultancy. I started it with $40,000 I had saved from 3 years of working 60-hour weeks at a commercial real estate firm. I slept on an air mattress in my office for the first 4 months. I ate rice and lentils 5 nights a week. I worked with a focus that had no word for tired. By year 3, we had 12 clients and 19 employees. By year 6, we had expanded into 2 states. By year 8, the year of that Christmas dinner, we had just completed the deal that would make me the controlling partner in a $41 million portfolio. My father did not know any of this, not because I hid it, because he never asked. Christmas Eve in the Mathews household was a production. My mother had been planning it since October. 40 people, a catered dinner, the good china, the house decorated with the kind of precision that made it look like a magazine spread. My parents hosted this every year, and every year it functioned as the primary annual exhibition of how well the Mathews family was doing. I arrived at 6. Marcus was already there, holding court in the living room with 2 of my uncles, talking about a project he had just been promoted to lead. My father stood nearby with his hand on Marcus's shoulder, nodding with the specific satisfaction of a man watching his legacy take shape. When I came through the door, my mother hugged me and said, "You look thin, Reena. Are you eating?" That was her hello. I took a seat at the far end of the table, which was where I always ended up at these things, near the cousins who were too young to care about professional achievements and too old to be entertained by the children's table. I did not mind. I ate my food and watched my family the way I had learned to watch markets, looking for information in the patterns people were not aware they were broadcasting. Marcus announced his promotion during the first course. The table responded the way tables respond when the golden child speaks, warmly, immediately, with the kind of enthusiastic affirmation that does not require the listener to understand what they are affirming. My father beamed. My mother said, "We always knew." Marcus caught my eye across the table and gave me a look that was not unkind, but was not exactly humble either. Halfway through the second course, my father set down his fork. He looked at me. The table did not go quiet exactly, but it shifted, the way a room shifts when the temperature changes. He said, "So, Reena, still doing your property thing?" My property thing? 8 years, $41 million, my property thing? I said, "Yes." He said, "And it's going fine?" The pause before fine carried everything he actually meant. I said, "It's going well." He tilted his head in the way he did when he was preparing to say something he had already decided to say. He said, "Reena, honestly, when are you going to stop pretending you're something you're not?" 22 people, the centerpiece my mother rearranged, Marcus and the ceiling. I sat with those words for a moment, let them land, let them find their place in the long shelf of similar words I had collected from this man over 32 years. Then I folded my napkin, stood up, and said, "Merry Christmas, everyone," and I walked out. I drove home. I sat in my car in my own parking garage for 11 minutes. Then I went inside and opened my laptop and worked until 2 in the morning, because work was the one place where what I was had never once been a question. My cousin Areaze called 4 days after Christmas. She was the one person in my extended family who had always dealt in honesty rather than performance. We were not dramatically close, but we had an understanding that went back to childhood. She would tell me the truth, and I would not punish her for it. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Fine. What happened?" She said, "Your dad has been talking?" My stomach did not drop. It simply tightened in the way of something that expected this. I said, "What is he saying?" She took a breath. "He told Uncle James and Aunt Bev that your company is basically a hobby operation, that you maybe have 5 clients and you are living on savings. He said he worries about you. He said Marcus has offered to help you find a proper position somewhere." A proper position? I walked to my office window and looked out at Charlotte's skyline. My company had 43 active clients, 61 employees. We had just been featured in a regional business publication. The $41 million deal had been covered in a commercial real estate trade journal with my name in the headline. My father had described me as a woman living on savings with 5 clients. I said, "Is there more?" Areaze was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your mom told my mom that they are worried you will eventually come to them for help, that they love you but they have limits and they cannot be your safety net forever." Their safety net? I had not asked my parents for money since I was 23 years old. I had sent my mother flowers on every birthday for 8 years. I had paid for my own flights to every family event. I had never, not once, presented them with a bill for anything. But in the story they were telling, I was already a burden waiting to arrive. I said, Adeaze, one more question. What is going on with Marcus? Another pause. She said, the promotion. It is not what it sounded like at dinner. The project he's leading, it ran into some issues. The budget is overrun significantly. There is talk that he may have to absorb some of the liability personally. I sat down. I said, how bad? She said, I don't know exact numbers, but your dad has been making calls. He is looking for options. Options. I knew that word. In my family, options meant someone else's resources applied to someone else's problem while the person with the problem retained all the credit. I said, thank you, Adeaze. She said, be careful, Reena. I said, always. I closed the call and sat at my desk for a long time. Then I opened a fresh document and started writing notes. Dates, quotes, patterns. Not out of anger, out of preparation. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Christmas. It came from a firm called Hartwell and Associates, a financial advisory group I had never heard of. The subject line read, Guarantor Notification, Project Liability Review. I opened it. The first line, this notice is to inform you that your signature appears as a secondary guarantor on a project financing agreement dated 14 months ago in the amount of $620,000. I read it twice. Then I downloaded the attached document and opened it and found a signature in my name on a page I had never seen, for a project I had never been told about, attached to a financing agreement I had never signed. The signature was close. It was not mine. The loop on the second E in Reena was wrong. The way I crossed the T in Mathews was not the way this pen had crossed it. Someone had practiced. Someone had studied my signature from documents they had access to. Family documents. My hands were steady when I picked up my phone and called my attorney, a woman named Claire Osei, who had handled my company's legal work for 5 years and who had the particular quality of being completely unshockable. She answered on the second ring. I said, Claire, someone has forged my signature on a $600,000 financing guarantee. A single beat of silence. She said, send me everything right now. Within 20 minutes, we were on a call together, the document open on both our screens. She said, this was not impulsive. The signature is practiced. They had access to your original signature on something else, and they used it as a reference. I said, I know who did it. She said, are you certain? I said, the project is Marcus's, the overrun Adeaze mentioned. They needed a guarantor with a clean financial profile and assets. They used my name because they assumed I would not find out or would not fight back. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Reena, I need to ask you directly, how do you want to handle this? I looked out my window at the Charlotte skyline. I thought about my father saying, pretending you're something you're not. I thought about my mother telling people I was a future burden. I thought about 22 people at a Christmas table waiting for me to break. I said, I want to handle it correctly, completely, and without leaving any part of my name attached to something I did not agree to. Claire said, and if that process has consequences for your family. I said, then those are the consequences of what they chose to do. She said, okay, we start tonight. And we did. Over the next 3 days, Claire and I pulled every thread. The financing agreement was tied to Marcus's project, specifically to a subcontract that had gone significantly over budget. The overrun had created a liability gap that the primary lender was unwilling to absorb. Someone, and the documentation trail pointed clearly to my father, had arranged a secondary guarantor to shore up the gap. My name, my signature, my credit history, my assets. used as a wall between Marcus and the consequences of a project that was failing. Claire presented it to me on a Friday morning, organized into a clear timeline. She said, "This is not a gray area legally, this is fraud. The signature is demonstrably not yours. The handwriting analysis we commissioned is unambiguous, and the financial benefit flows entirely to Marcus's and your father's interest in protecting him." I said, "What are the options?" She laid them out. 1. Report it, pursue criminal charges, extricate my name from the agreement through legal challenge, allow the liability to fall where it actually belongs. 2. Report it, challenge the signature, and simultaneously position myself to acquire the underlying project asset if the financing collapses. 3. Contact my family directly, give them an opportunity to correct it voluntarily, and document their response. I sat with the 3 options for a moment. I said, "Start with 3. Give them the chance to do the right thing. Document everything and prepare for option 2 simultaneously." Claire looked at me over her glasses. She said, "Most people in your position would go straight to 1. I said, "I know, but I want to be able to look at this later and know I gave them the choice." She nodded. She said, "I'll draft the letter." The letter went out on a Monday, formal, precise, legal in tone. It identified the document, identified the discrepancy, noted our intention to pursue formal authentication, and invited a voluntary response within 72 hours. 72 hours passed. No response. Claire filed the challenge. My brother called on a Wednesday evening. I almost did not answer. I answered. I said, "Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who has rehearsed what they were going to say and now has arrived at the moment and found the rehearsal insufficient. He said, "We need to talk about the letter." I said, "Okay." He said, "Dad didn't mean it to become this. It was supposed to be temporary. He was going to tell you. He just needed to stabilize the project first, and then he was going to explain." I said, "He forged my signature, Marcus." Another silence. He said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." I said, "That is not the same as it being acceptable." He said, "I know." 2 words, but the way he said them was different from anything I had heard from my brother in 32 years of being his sister. Not defensive, not strategic, just tired. I said, "Did you know when it happened?" A pause. He said, "I found out after. I told Dad it was wrong. He said it was the only option. He said you would never find out, or if you did, you would understand because it was family." I said, "Family?"
Said, "I know how that sounds." I said, "Marcus, I need you to tell me something honestly, not as Dad's son, as my brother. Did you know what my company actually looked like? What I had actually built?" A long pause. He said, "I saw the article 2 months ago, the trade journal. I didn't tell Dad." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because he would have found a way to minimize it, and because I was ashamed that he didn't already know, that neither of us knew." I sat with that for a while. I said, "What do you want, Marcus?" He said, "I want to fix this, not for the project, for us, for whatever us is now." I said, "Then here is what fixing it looks like. You speak to Claire. You provide a full voluntary account of what you knew and when. You cooperate with the authentication process. You do not ask me to make this smaller than it is." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then we see." He said, "Reena, I'm sorry." I had waited a long time to hear those words from someone in my family. They did not arrive with a fanfare. They arrived at 9:15 on a Wednesday in a plain phone call from a brother who finally sounded like someone I might actually know. I said, "I hear you." I did not say, "It's okay." It was not okay yet, but it was a beginning. My father called the following Monday, not to apologize, to propose a meeting. He said, "We should sit down, all of us, discuss this like adults." I said, "Yes." Thursday, my office, 7 in the evening. A pause. He had expected to name the location. The pause was him recalibrating. He said, "Fine." My office was not designed to intimidate, but it was designed to be honest. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of industry reports and legal references, a conference table I had bought myself, the Charlotte skyline through glass. Framed on the wall, the trade journal feature, my name in the headline, the company's growth numbers in the first paragraph. I placed nothing on the table deliberately. I simply let the room speak. My parents arrived at 7 exactly. My father in his architect's bearing, straight-backed, composed. My mother in the composed expression she wore when she was managing her own fear. Marcus came separately, 2 minutes later, and sat not beside my parents but at the side of the table, equidistant. I noted that. Claire sat to my right. My father looked around the office the way people look around a room when they are recalibrating their understanding of who they are dealing with. His eyes went to the framed article. He read the headline. He looked at me. I let him look. He said, "This is quite an office." I said, "Thank you. I built it." Claire opened her folder. She walked them through the documentation with the clean efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found drama unnecessary. The signature analysis, the timeline, the financial benefit trail, the 72-hour notice and the absence of response. My mother's hand went to her collarbone. My father's jaw was tight. When Claire finished, he said, "We intended to tell you." I said, "When?" He said, "When the project stabilized." I said, "That is not consent. Intending to tell someone after the fact is not the same as asking them first." He said, "Reena, we are family." I said, "Yes, which is exactly why this is worse." He looked at the table. My mother said, "We didn't think you would find out this way." I said, "How did you think I would find out?" She did not have an answer. I said, "I want to tell you both something, not as a legal position, as your daughter." They looked at me. I said, "I have built something real. I have been building it for 8 years while you told people I was pretending, while you told people I might need a safety net, while you described my company as a hobby to anyone who would listen. I built it anyway, not for you, but I want you to understand that it exists." My father said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I saw the article." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't tell your mother." I said, "I know that too." A silence. He said, "Why didn't you tell us yourself?" I said, "Because you never asked." The room was very quiet. Claire placed the resolution documents on the table. She said, "There are 2 paths forward: a full voluntary correction of the record, cooperation with the authentication process, and formal release of Miss Matthews's name from all associated documents, or we pursue this through formal legal channels." My father looked at the papers. For the first time in my life, he looked at something my world had produced and did not look for a way to minimize it. He said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "The truth on record, that the signature was not mine, that I did not authorize it. That is all I need." He said, "And the project?" I said, "The project is not my responsibility. It never was." He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table. My father picked up the pen. He signed the cooperation agreement. My mother signed beside him. The room exhaled. The project collapsed 4 weeks later, not catastrophically, not publicly. It was absorbed into the financial restructuring of the primary lender's portfolio, which meant that the liability landed where it had always actually lived, with the parties who had actually created it. My name was formally removed from every associated document. Marcus took on a reduced role at his firm while the liability questions were resolved. He did not lose his career. He did not lose his home. He lost some ground, and he began the slower, quieter work of earning it back. My father retired from his firm 6 months after that meeting, not because of this, he had been considering it for a while, but the timing gave it a particular quality. He moved into a smaller rhythm, more time at home, a woodworking project he had been putting off for years. My mother called me on a Sunday in March. She did not announce herself with a topic or an agenda. She just said, "I was thinking about you." I said, "Hi, Mom." She said,
how are you actually? Not how are you as a formality, actually. I said, good, genuinely good. She said, I saw something online about your company, a new hire announcement. 63 employees now? I said, 64 as of last week. A pause. She said, I didn't know. I said, I know. She said, I should have asked. I said, yes. Another pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like two people standing at the beginning of a path that had not been there before. She said, can I take you to lunch sometime? Just us? I said, yes, I would like that. We went in April. We sat at a small Italian restaurant downtown, and we talked for 2.5 hours, and for the first time in my memory, the conversation was not about appearances or expectations, or the careful management of what things looked like. It was just two people talking. She told me things about her own life I had not known, about what she had wanted before she became my mother, about the ways she had also made herself smaller inside my father's particular gravity. I told her what the first year of the company had actually been like: the air mattress, the rice and lentils, the night I sat in my car in an empty parking lot and did not know if I could keep going, and drove back to my office and kept going anyway. She listened. She did not perform listening, she actually listened. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, she hugged me in a way she had not hugged me in a very long time. She said, "You are something, Reena." I said, "I know, Mom." She laughed. It was a real laugh. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was only April and still cool, and the city moved past me in the particular way of a place that has become genuinely yours. Marcus texted that evening. He said, "Mom told me you had lunch." I said, "We did." He said, "How was it?" I said, "Good. Different." He said, "Different how?" I said, "Honest." A pause. He said, "Can we do that sometime? Lunch? Just us?" I said, "Yes, when you're ready." He said, "I'm working on it." I said, "I know. I can tell." It is 8 months since Christmas Eve. My father has never fully apologized. He called me in June, and we talked for 40 minutes about the city's development projects and the commercial real estate market, and he asked 2 questions about my company that were genuine questions, not tests, and before he hung up, he said, "You know what you're doing." That was all. You know what you're doing. From Reena Mathews, that was not nothing. That was considerable. I am not waiting for a larger apology. I am not keeping a ledger of what I am owed. Ledgers of that kind are heavy to carry, and the carrying costs more than the debt is worth. I expanded into a 3rd state in August, 71 employees now. I started a mentorship program for young women in commercial real estate, specifically targeting women who come from backgrounds where nobody told them this was a space for them, because nobody told me either, and I had to figure it out by deciding to walk in anyway. I have a life that is genuinely mine, not the life that was planned for me, not the life that was described to church friends over the holidays. Mine. On a Sunday evening in October, I stood on my balcony with a cup of tea, and I thought about Christmas Eve, about 22 people at a table, about my father's voice saying, "Pretending you're something you're not." I thought about what I had built since the night I walked out of that house into the December cold. I thought about my mother saying, "You are something, Reena." I thought about Marcus saying, "I'm working on it." I thought about my father saying, "You know what you're doing." None of it was what I had wanted when I was younger. What I had wanted when I was younger was simple: for them to see me. They are starting to. Late, incomplete, still learning how, but starting. And I have learned something I did not know on Christmas Eve. The opposite of being unseen is not being celebrated. It is simply being known. Known for what you actually are, not for the shape of the wound they needed you to fill, not for the role in the story they were already telling, but for the thing you actually built while they were looking elsewhere. I am 32 years old. My name is Reena Mathews. I know what I am, and for the first time in my life, that is entirely enough.